was a tank in Normandy in the summer of 1944 that could not be killed from the front. Not by anything the American army had. Not by the gun they called the wonder gun of the war. 6 shells at 200 yards proved it, on a quiet morning in a hayfield full of scorched grass. And a general at Supreme Headquarters, reading the report, understood what the price was going to be. The morning of July 11th, 1944, a hayfield outside Isigny-sur-Mer, in the low green country of western Normandy. 2 weeks earlier, cattle had grazed here. Now the cattle were gone, and the grass had been trampled flat by boots, by treads, by the quiet business of men in pressed uniforms preparing to test a theory. At one end of the field sat a Panther tank. It had been captured intact a few days earlier. Its paint was still the mottled ambush pattern. The German crews had rolled onto it at the factory. Its long 75mm gun pointed at nothing in particular. No engine ran, no radio crackled. It sat in the field the way a bull sits in a pasture. Silent, enormous, waiting. At the other end of the field, roughly 200 yards away, an American Sherman rolled into firing position. The Sherman mounted a brand new 76mm gun. The same gun American ordnance officers had promised would handle anything the Germans could field. The same gun staff officers back in Washington had spent nearly a year describing as the answer. The answer to the heavy German armor. The answer to the burning tanks. The answer to the letters that mothers in Iowa and Tennessee were beginning to open on their front porches. The senior ordnance officer present stood at the edge of the field. He watched the Sherman settle into position. He listened to the last radio check. He waited for the first round. The first round fired, the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth. 6 standard armor-piercing capped rounds. 6 projectiles slamming into the sloped glacis plate of a Panther tank at velocities approaching 2,600 feet per second. And 6 rounds that simply skipped off into the hedgerows like flat stones thrown across still water. The Panther did not move. The Panther did not burn. The Panther sat in the field with a few scorch marks on its front plate and the smell of scorched paint drifting away on the summer wind, and it was as untouched by American ordnance as it had been at the moment of its capture. The senior officer standing at the edge of the field did not need to wait for the written report. He understood immediately what the next telephone call from Supreme Headquarters was going to sound like. He knew, standing there in the grass, with the sound of gunfire fading, that thousands of young men were going to die because of what had just failed to happen. 9 days earlier, that telephone call had already begun. July 2nd, 1944, Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, Southern England, General Dwight D. Eisenhower sat at his desk, 53 years old. Supreme, our commander, the man who had signed the order that put 150,000 men of Normandy on the 6th of June, the man who was now watching those men crawl forward through hedgerows, yard by yard, at a cost he could count in coffins. The door opened. Lieutenant General J. Lawton Collins walked in. Collins commanded the U.S. 7th Corps. He had been in Normandy. He had walked the lanes where American Shermans lay burned out in ditches, their crews still inside. He had spoken with the surviving tankers. He had heard the same thing. From every one of them, he carried that thing into Eisenhower's office and set it down in front of the Supreme's commander. In the plainest words he could find, the 76mm gun could not penetrate a Panther's frontal armor. Eisenhower stared at him. ADs in the room later described what happened next in 3 separate accounts. All 3 agreed on the essentials. Eisenhower's jaw tightened. The blood rose in his face. He looked up from the report on his desk, and when he spoke, his voice was low, almost quiet. "You mean our 76 won't knock these Panthers out?" The room went still. "Why? I thought it was going to be the wonder gun of the war." Then the language changed. Witnesses who had served with Eisenhower for years, who had watched him hold his temper through the disasters over Sicily, through the endless negotiations with Montgomery and de Gaulle and Churchill, described what followed as the angriest they had ever heard, the supreme commander of Allied forces in Europe. He had been told, repeatedly, that the 76mm gun would handle anything in the German inventory. He had been told this in writing. He had passed those written assurances down to his army group commanders, and every one of those assurances, he now understood, had been wrong. Somewhere in Normandy, at that exact moment, young American tank crews were dying for that mistake. To understand how it had come to this, the story has to step back 6 months, to January of 1944, to the American production lines, where the first Sherman tanks, fitted with the new 76mm M1 gun, were rolling off the assembly floor. Winter in Detroit, snow on the roofs of the tank arsenals, steam rising from the boilers of the foundries that fed molten steel into the presses, that shaped hull plates and turret rings, and the long, slender barrels of a new gun. The 76mm gun had been ready earlier than that. Ordnance engineers had developed it through 1943, specifically to give the Sherman more punch. Field reports from Tunisia had been clear. Field reports from Sicily had been clearer. Field reports from the mud of Italy had been clearest of all. The standard 75mm gun was running out of margin. German armour was getting thicker. The American medium tank needed a bigger gun. By February of 1944, the first Sherman 70mm were being loaded onto freighters in the harbours of the American East Coast. By early April, they had crossed the Atlantic. By April 10th, 130 of them had been delivered to American depots in southern England. They sat there, paint still fresh, ammunition racks empty, waiting to be issued to combat units in time for the invasion of France. They were never issued. The decision came from the top of the American command structure. Lieutenant General Omar N. Bradley, 51 years old, commander of the 1st United States Army, made the call. He gave 3 reasons. He believed his Sherman crews needed time to train on a new weapon system. He believed the logistical burden of pushing 2 different types of tank ammunition across the invasion beaches was unacceptable. And most importantly, he believed the 75mm gun would be sufficient for whatever the Germans had waiting on the other side of the English Channel. He was supported in that belief by his intelligence section. American military intelligence in the spring of 1944 had produced a series of estimates on the likely composition of German armoured forces in the West. Those estimates concluded that Panther tanks would constitute a small fraction of German armour in Normandy. A nuisance, not a threat. The bulk of what American crews would face would be Panzer IVs and assault guns, machines the 75mm Sherman could handle at combat ranges. The estimates were wrong. By the time American forces hit the beaches on the 6th of June, Panthers made up roughly 40% of the German medium tanks in the theatre. Not a fraction, not a nuisance. Nearly half of everything a Sherman was likely to meet in the hedgerows. The 130 new tanks continued to sit in their English depots. The men who would need them continued to load ammunition racks with 75mm shells and climb into machines that could not defeat what was waiting for them in the hayfields and orchards and sunken lanes of the Norman countryside. By the second week of fighting, the bodies of American tankers were being pulled from burning Shermans in numbers that nobody at Bradley's headquarters had prepared for. Crews learned within days what their commanders had not understood. The 75mm gun could not penetrate a Panther's frontal armour at any range, not at 1,000 yards, not at 500, not at 50. The Sherman's response, when it encountered a Panther head-on, was either to manoeuvre for a flank shot through the thinner side armour, or to die trying. In the hedgerow country, where engagement ranges sometimes dropped to 50 yards, there was rarely time to manoeuvre. While Eisenhower sat in his office and read the Isigny report, 400 miles to the north, a young American officer was finishing the final weeks of training his battalion in England. His name was Creighton Williams Abrams, Jr., Lieutenant Colonel, commander of the 37th Tank Battalion, part of the 4th Armoured Division. He was 29 years old, 5'10", broad in the shoulders. He carried a cigar in his mouth, whether he was smoking it or not. His soldiers had nicknames for him, some affectionate, some less so, and all of them came down to the same observation. Abrams did not flinch. In April and May of 1944, while 130 new Sherman 76mm sat in depots he had never seen, Abrams was working his crews 7 days a week on the older 75mm version, gunnery drills at Salisbury Plain, maintenance training in cold metal sheds where the wind cut through the walls and the men worked with numb fingers on tools that would not quite grip, tactical exercises across the rolling, green fields of southern England, fields that looked nothing at all like the close hedgerow country waiting for them across the channel. He knew his men were going to fight Panthers. He had read the intelligence. He had read the reports. He had also read between the lines of those reports and understood what the men writing them had not quite dared to write. What he did not know, what no one at his rank knew yet, was that a solution to the Panther problem had already been engineered, manufactured in small quantities. Sat waiting in a quiet brick building outside Boston. That building was Watertown Arsenal. Inside Watertown since the spring of 1942, American ordnance engineers had been working on a new type of armor-piercing round. A round that did not rely on a solid steel core to defeat enemy armor. A round built around something much harder, much rarer, much more deadly. A core of tungsten carbide. The project carried the experimental designation T4. By the time it was standardized for service, it would be known as the M93, and to the tank crews who eventually fired it, it would carry one name and one name only: HVAP, high-velocity armor-piercing. The physics behind it were elegant and brutal. A standard armor-piercing round defeated armor through brute mass. A heavy steel projectile slammed into steel plates at high speed, and it either punched through, or it did not. The harder the armor, the more mass and velocity you needed. HVAP changed the equation entirely. The new round used a small, dense tungsten carbide core, surrounded by a lightweight aluminum body and a thin ballistic windshield. The core was the actual penetrator. The aluminum body simply carried it through the gun barrel and stabilized it in flight. Because the carrier body was so light, the safe gun could push the core to far higher velocities than it could ever push a conventional steel projectile. The numbers were dramatic. Where the standard 76mm armor-piercing round left the muzzle at roughly 2,600 feet per second, the HVAP round left the muzzle at nearly 3,400, just over 1,000 meters per second. That extra velocity, concentrated into a smaller and harder penetrator, translated directly into the ability to defeat armor that had been considered effectively immune to American tank guns. In testing, the M93 could punch through a Panther's curved gun mantlet at ranges out to 1,000 yards. It still could not defeat the sloped glacis plate reliably, but the mantlet was a viable target. For the first time in the war, a Sherman crew that took a frontal shot at a Panther would have a real chance of hitting something the round could go through. The first production batch of M93 rounds had been completed in early 1944. By July, when Eisenhower was reading the Isigny report, only a few hundred of them existed in the world, and every single one of them was still on American soil. None had crossed the Atlantic. None had reached Normandy. None had been loaded into a Sherman that was fighting Panthers in the bocage that summer. Behind the American spearheads, in the country south of St. Lo, a first lieutenant named Belton Y. Cooper drove a jeep along the trail of burned tanks. He was 26 years old, a maintenance liaison officer attached to the 3rd Armored Division. He had a job that nobody had ever volunteered for. He had to count the dead Shermans. Every day, he drove out behind the advancing armor. He found the machines that had been hit. He assessed what could be recovered and what could not. He filled out forms in triplicate. He wrote down serial numbers. He noted the caliber of the round that had killed each tank, if that could be determined from the entry wound. Some of the Shermans could be repaired. Their crews would survive their wounds and returned to fight another day. Many could not be repaired. Their crews in those cases had not survived at all. Cooper kept a notebook. He carried it with him every day. He wrote in it at night, by lantern, with the sound of artillery drifting in from the east. He wrote about the smell of cordite and burnt cork, and something else that he did not name in print. He wrote about the work of recovering bodies that had been twisted by the heat of a tank fire into shapes that did not look human anymore. He wrote about the loaders and the drivers and the gunners and the tank commanders who had opened the hatches too late, and the tank commanders who had opened the hatches in time and been cut down by machine gun fire before they could clear the turret. Most of those Shermans had been killed by Panthers. None of those Panthers had been killed by anything an American Sherman crew was currently carrying. Decades later, Cooper would take the notebook and shape it into a memoir. He would call the memoir Death Traps. The title was not a metaphor. By late July of 1944, the situation on the American side of the front could be described in a single sentence. The United States Army possessed both a better gun and a better round. Neither one was in the hands of the people who needed them. The 130 new Sherman, 76mm, that had been sitting in English depots since April, were finally being rushed forward. On Bradley's emergency order, they would see combat for the first time during Operation Cobra, the Great American Breakout from the hedgerows, on the 25th of July. They would perform better than the 75mm version. But with the standard M62 armor-piercing round, they still could not reliably defeat a Panther from the front. The first shipment of M93 HVAP rounds, the tungsten-core answer to the whole problem, was still on the American side of the ocean. It would not arrive in Europe until the first week of September. And when it did, there would be roughly 1,000 rounds for the entire European theatre, divided down and through army groups and armies and corps and divisions and battalions, until each Sherman 76mm would receive 4 to 6 of them, 4 to 6 rounds, to hold off an army equipped with 3,000 Panthers. But that was still weeks in the future. But now, in the second week of July of 1944, General Dwight Eisenhower sat at his desk in southern England and held a piece of paper in his hands. He looked at the words on it. He looked at the signatures at the bottom, and he tried to understand how it had come to this. In a brick laboratory outside Boston, a small team of metallurgists worked overtime on a tungsten-core projectile they believed could solve the problem. In a hayfield outside Isigny-sur-Mer, the captured Panther tank sat undamaged in the grass, scorched paint on its mantlet from 6 bounced rounds, a quiet monument to a decision that had been made too late. And in a training area on Salisbury Plain, in the cold English rain, a 29-year-old lieutenant colonel named Creighton Abrams ran his men through one more gunnery drill. He bit down on his cigar. Zigger. He listened to the radio traffic. He watched a line of 75mm Shermans move across the plain in the formation he had taught them, and he thought about the country waiting for them on the other side of the channel. Then he went back to his tent. He sat down at a small folding table, and he wrote orders for movement to France. The fight was about to begin. 2 weeks after Eisenhower had held that report in his hands, the American army made its move. July 25, 1944, just before 11 in the morning, south of Saint-Lô, in a narrow corridor of Norman countryside, about 4 miles wide, 1,500 American heavy bombers came in over the horizon. B-17 Flying Fortresses, B-24 Liberators, hundreds of medium bombers behind them, hundreds of fighter bombers behind those, the largest tactical airstrike in the history of warfare up to that point. The men on the ground heard them coming from a long way off. First as a low humming in the sky, like a distant hive. Then as a rolling thunder that shook the leaves in the hedgerows. Then as the roar of 2,000 engines directly overhead, so loud that men clapped their hands over their ears and screamed into the ground and could not hear their own voices. The bombs began to fall. The target was a corridor held by the Panzer Division, one of the most feared armoured formations in the Wehrmacht, a division that had been raised from the German army's own training establishments, filled with experienced instructors. Still one of the strongest Dutch German armoured divisions in Normandy, despite 6 weeks of hard fighting. For an hour, the Panzer was buried alive. Bombs fell in stripes across the corridor. Trees came down in whole rows. Tanks were flipped over, their treads still turning, and dropped upside down into craters that had not existed 30 seconds earlier. Men in foxholes were killed by concussion alone. Their lungs collapsed inside them, no visible wound anywhere on their bodies. Some of the bombs fell short. They landed on American positions. They killed American soldiers. Among the dead that morning was Lieutenant General Leslie J. McNair, 61 years old, the highest-ranking American officer to die in the European theater of the war. A man who had come to the front to observe the offensive he had helped shape. He had been the architect of American armored doctrine. He had spent years arguing about how tanks should be built, and how tank crews should be trained, and how tanks should be used in the Great War he had known was coming. He died in a foxhole, a few hundred yards from the leading Sherman battalions, when a stick of American 500-pounders walked across his position and left nothing recognizable behind. The doctrine he had built outlived him. That doctrine was about to become the reason young American tank crews were dying with the wrong ammunition in their racks. Because HVAP existed, the M93, the tungsten-core round, the answer. By late July of 1944, several hundred rounds of it had already been produced at Watertown Arsenal outside Boston. They were sitting in wooden crates on wooden for pallets in warehouses along the American East Coast. Some were already being loaded aboard Liberty ships bound for England. None of them were going to Shermans. They were going to tank destroyers. The M18 Hellcat, the M36 Jackson, open-topped, thinly armored, fast-moving vehicles built specifically for what the American Army called the tank destroyer role. That was McNair's doctrine talking. From beyond the grave. McNair had believed, and had convinced the entire army to believe, that tanks were for supporting infantry. Tanks were not supposed to fight other tanks. When enemy armor showed up on the battlefield, the correct American response was to call in the tank destroyers. Specialized vehicles, specialized crews, specialized ammunition. The Hellcats and Jacksons would race in, engage the enemy armor, and race out. The Shermans would keep doing what Shermans were meant to do, which was to roll forward with the infantry and knock out machine gun nests and blow up bunkers. That was the theory. In the hedgerows of Normandy, the theory was already dead. Shermans were fighting Panthers every single day, not because anyone had ordered them to, because the Panthers were in the way, because there was nowhere to call the tank destroyers from, because the war on the ground had never bothered to read McNair's doctrinal manual. But the ammunition distribution followed the doctrine. The Hellcats got the HVAP first. The Jacksons got it second. The Shermans, the tanks that were actually doing most of the fighting and most of the dying, got whatever was left. In the summer of 1944, what was left was almost nothing, because there was almost nothing to begin with. The reason for that came down to a single element on the periodic table: tungsten, atomic number 74, heavier than lead, melts at over 6,000 degrees Fahrenheit, harder than almost anything on Earth except diamond. And in the year 1944, the majority of the world's accessible tungsten deposits sat inside the borders of two countries, China and Bolivia. The Chinese deposits, most of them in Jiangxi province in the south-central part of the country, had produced roughly 36% of the world's tungsten before the war. By 1944, Japanese occupation of the Chinese coastline had turned the export of that tungsten into a logistical nightmare. What made it out of China, moved by junk and truck and porter over mountain trails to unoccupied ports in the interior, then across the ocean in convoys that had to thread narrow corridors of contested water. Some of it made it, most of it did not. The Bolivian deposits high in the Andes above La Paz and Oruro were the reliable source. American poaching agents had locked in long-term contracts before the war was even underway. Mules and trucks carried the raw ore down the mountain roads. Railroads carried it to Pacific ports. Freighters carried it north to refineries on the American West Coast. But there was never enough. The American war economy in 1944 had three main competing demands for every pound of tungsten that came off those freighters. The first and largest was machine tools. The cutting bits used to manufacture aircraft engines, gun barrels, ship turbines, and every other piece of precision machinery in the entire war effort. Those bits were made from tungsten carbide. Without them, American industry slowed. With them, American industry could outproduce anything Germany or Japan could put in the field. The second demand was armor-piercing ammunition, not just for the Sherman's 76mm gun. Also for the 90mm gun going onto the M36 tank destroyer. Also for the 90mm anti-aircraft gun being adapted for anti-tank work. Every HVAP round, in every caliber, ate into the same tungsten budget that machine shops needed. The third demand was smaller but real. Tungsten alloys went into certain types of armor plate, into certain electrical contacts, into the filaments of radio tubes. Each of those uses had a constituency in Washington. Each of those constituencies was fighting for its share. In the spring of 1944, when the question came down to whether the scarce tungsten allocation should be diverted from machine tools into mass production of HVAP rounds, the answer was no. Industry came first. That decision was made in air-conditioned offices in Washington by men who had never seen a burning Sherman tank, who had never smelled cordite mixed with burning rubber and something worse, who had never had to write a letter to a mother in Iowa explaining what had happened to her son. The men who would live with that decision were finishing their training in England and then dying with it in Normandy. By early September of 1944, the first significant shipment of M93 HVAP rounds finally arrived on the European continent. A Liberty ship docked at Cherbourg. Longshoremen unloaded wooden crates, stenciled with Watertown Arsenal markings, roughly 1,000 rounds in total, for the entire European theatre. Distribution went down through the supply chain in a way that would feel painfully familiar to any man who has ever worked inside a large bureaucracy. The 12th Army Group Ordnance Section divided the shipment among the armies. The armies divided their share among the corps. The corps divided their share among the divisions. The divisions divided their share among the battalions. The battalions divided their share among the companies. By the time the wooden crates reached the platoon sergeants, who would actually hand the rounds to the gunners, who would actually fire them, the math had been ground down by simple arithmetic. 4 rounds per tank, in some cases 6, in a few cases none at all. Crews were told to save them, to use them only for Panthers and Tigers. Not for Panzer IVs, not for assault guns, not for anything that ordinary armor-piercing could handle. Verify the target before opening fire. Because once the 4 rounds were gone, they were gone, and there was no telling when the next shipment might come. Tank commanders began carrying handwritten lists in their breast pockets. How many HVAP rounds remained in each tank in their platoon? Which tank had already fired its allocation and could not be relied on for a long-range duel with a Panther? Which tank still had all 4 and could be sent forward as the platoon's anti-tank reserve? That was how the American Army was fighting the war in the fall of 1944. Meanwhile, 300 miles to the east, another problem was building. The lead elements of the US Third Army had crossed France faster than any American formation had ever crossed anything. Their commander was George S. Patton. 59 years old, profane, brilliant, impatient beyond the reach of ordinary language. He had driven his armoured divisions across France with a kind of controlled fury, and by early September, his forward units had reached the Moselle River. From the Moselle to the Rhine was less than 100 miles. From the Rhine to Berlin was a war-winning movement. He never got the gasoline to do it. The supply lines from the invasion beaches had been stretched too far. The Red Ball Express, the truck convoy system that had been improvised to keep Patton's tanks moving, could not keep up. By mid-September, his armoured divisions were down to a few hours of fuel per tank. But one division still had enough to push forward. The 4th Armoured Division, Lieutenant Colonel Division. They pushed across the Mocraton in the first weeks of September and established a bridgehead near a small town called Arracourt in the flat country of Lorraine in eastern France. The Germans noticed. In a bunker in East Prussia, Adolf Hitler studied the situation map. He saw the American bridgehead. He saw the exposed flank. He saw an opportunity. He had 2 newly raised panzer brigades available in the west. the 111th and the 113th. Freshly equipped with Panther tanks, straight off the production lines at Daimler-Benz and MAN. He would smash them into the American bridgehead. He would push Patton back across the Moselle. He would buy time for the construction of the defences along Germany's western border. The order went to General de Panzertruppe Hasso von Manteuffel. Manteuffel was 47 years old, a small, wiry man barely over 5 feet tall. He carried the bearing of generations of Prussian officers, and he had recently been given command of the 5th Panzer Army in the west. He had not chosen this counterattack. He understood, looking at the same maps Hitler was looking at, exactly what was going to happen if he did what he was being told to do. The Panzer brigades were not ready. Their crews had been through 6 weeks of training. 6 weeks. Some of them had never fired a live main gun round, because there had not been enough fuel to run proper gunnery exercises. They knew their machines only in the way a man knows a rifle he has just been handed at the armory. They had never trued with infantry. They had never trained with infantry. They had never trained with proper reconnaissance elements, because Hitler's own directive on Panzer Brigade organization had eliminated the reconnaissance companies. He believed the brigades should move forward in armored fists and smash through American lines by sheer weight. That was the doctrine. That was the order. Manteuffel read the order. He knew what it meant. He knew what it would cost. He sent them anyway. He was a soldier of the Wehrmacht. The order came from the Chancellery. Manteuffel had built his career on doing what he was told, and he was going to do it now, even though he already understood how the story was going to end. The 113th Panzer Brigade moved out first, then the 111th. They rolled toward the American bridgehead at Arracourt through the cold, wet nights of mid-September. The autumn fog was already thick along the Moselle Valley. Every morning, the crews woke up in tanks whose steel hulls had grown so cold overnight that a man's palm stuck to the metal for a moment before he could pull it away. On the morning of September 19th, 1944, the fog was so heavy that the lead tanks could not see 50 feet ahead of themselves. They rolled forward anyway, at a position south of the village of Les, on a low ridge overlooking the country the Germans were about to cross. Captain James H. Leach's Company B of the 37th Tank Battalion sat in hull-down positions and waited. Leach was in his early 20s, ordinary height, ordinary features, the kind of face you would not pick out of a crowd. But he had been briefed the night before, and he had briefed his crews, and every man in every Sherman in his company understood exactly what was coming. Panthers. Each tank had 4 to 6 HVAP rounds in the ready rack. The order was simple: wait for them to come close. The fog will keep them close, then fire. The first Panthers rolled out of the mist at a distance of about 75 meters. 75 meters. At that range, the Panther's long 75mm gun, with its superior optics and its 3,000-yard effective range, meant nothing at all. At that range, the American Sherman's 76mm gun, even firing standard armor-piercing rounds, could hit a Panther turret cleanly. And at that range, with HVAP loaded and a good gunner behind the sights, a Sherman could pick its shot. The Americans fired first. The first Panther's turret took a round through the mantlet at 75 meters. The tank stopped. Smoke leaked from the hatches. Nobody came out. A second Panther rolled past the first one, blind in the fog, hunting for the source of the fire. A Sherman gunner put a round into its side, where the armor was only 40 millimeters thick. The Panther brewed up immediately, orange flame boiling from the engine deck, and it was already burning as it rolled to a stop. Within the first 10 minutes of contact, the 113th Panzer Brigade lost 5 Panthers and 3 Panzer IVs without ever being able to see the American positions. The German crews, fresh from training, did what their doctrine told them to do. They tried to push forward through the contact. They lost more tanks doing it. The battle continued for 11 days. It spread across the flat farm country, north and east of Arracourt, into small villages with names most Americans had never heard and would never hear again. Vic-sur-Seille, Moyenvic, Chateau Salines. The 111th Panzer Brigade was committed. It was destroyed just as thoroughly as the 113th had been. Somewhere in that mess on September 20th, the day after the first ambush, the commander of the 113th Panzer Brigade was killed. His name was Oberst Erich Freiherr von Seckendorf. He had been leading from a command vehicle in the forward area, trying to make sense of a battle he could not see. When it was over, his body was recovered from the wreckage. The highest-ranking German officer killed at Arracourt. By the 29th of September, the fighting had ended. The 113th Panzer Brigade had gone into the battle with approximately 90 operational tanks and assault guns. It came out with fewer than 20. The 111th had been reduced to a similar shell. Together, the two brigades had lost roughly 86 armoured vehicles destroyed or damaged beyond recovery. The American 4th Armoured Division had lost 25 Shermans and 7 tank destroyers. The exchange ratio was crushing. The story got told in newspapers back in the United States as a triumph of American technology. HVAP had saved the day. The tungsten round had done what nothing else could. The 76mm Sherman had proved itself against the Panther. The men who had actually fought at Arracourt understood a different story. The fog had won most of the battle. The fog had stripped the Panther of every one of its advantages. Its long range meant nothing, when you could not see beyond 100 yards. Its superior optics meant nothing when there was nothing to look at through them. Its powerful gun meant nothing when it was firing at ghosts. The fog had forced the German crews to advance blind, in column formation, straight into prepared American kill zones. The doctrine had won part of the battle. The newly raised German panzer brigades had no proper reconnaissance to warn them about the American positions. They had no integrated infantry moving forward with them. They had no air cover, because the Luftwaffe had been broken over Germany months earlier and could not put fighters into the sky over Lorraine. The Americans had all three. P-47 Thunderbolts from the Tactical Air Command flew through breaks in the cloud cover and dove on German columns with rockets and machine guns. When the fog was too thick for aircraft, tank destroyer battalions equipped with M18 Hellcats used their speed to swing around the German flanks and hit the columns from the sides. Fast, lightly armoured, mounting the same 76mm gun as the new Shermans and carrying more HVAP per vehicle than the tank battalions did, the Hellcats did a share of the killing at Arracourt that the newspapers back home never reported. The training had won part of it. The Americans had been fighting since Normandy. They knew their machines. They knew how to call in artillery. They knew how to talk to the air support. The German crews had 6 weeks of training. 6 weeks was not enough, and HAP had won part of it. The Panther mantlets that had bounced every American round in Normandy were no longer immune. American gunners, when they got the right angle, at the right range with the right ammunition, could now punch through. But the limits of that ammunition were about to become visible. 2 months later, on the 20th of November, 1944, a Sherman tank from the 2nd Armoured Division engaged a German Panther in the open country near the town of Pufendorf, just outside the German city of Aachen. The tank commander was Sergeant Francis W. Baker, 24 years old, a veteran of the North African campaign, the invasion of Sicily, and the fighting in Normandy. The kind of man who had learned his trade the hard way, and had lived long enough to be very good at it. His gun was the 76mm M1. His ammunition rack contained M93 HEAP rounds, more of them than he had carried at any point earlier in the war. The supply situation had improved slightly since September. The Panther presented its side at a range of approximately 800 yards. The side armour of a Panther was 40mm of vertical steel, the thinnest plate on the tank. At 800 yards with HVAP, that plate should have been paper. Baker's gunner fired the first round. The tracer curved out across the open ground. It struck the Panther's flank cleanly, in a spot where the round should have gone straight through and killed everyone inside. It bounced. The gunner fired a second round. It bounced. A third round. It bounced. Baker sat in the commander's cupola and watched the 4th and the 5th and the 6th and the 7th round curve, out of his tank's barrel and strike the Panther's flank and skitter away into the fields beyond. 7 rounds. All 7 hit. None of them penetrated. The Panther turned away. It withdrew without returning fire. Its crew never seemed to know exactly where the shots were coming from, or perhaps they simply decided that whatever was firing at them was not worth engaging, and they had somewhere else to be. Baker's tank sat in the November mud, with an empty ready rack of HVAP and a gunner who was not speaking. Later, Baker would testify to American ordnance investigators about what he had seen. He described watching the orange streaks of his own tracer rounds curve into the German tank and bounce off the side plate at angles that should have killed everyone inside. He described the silence in his own turret. Afterward, he described the slow, cold understanding that the round they had been told would save their lives could fail. The metallurgists at Watertown Arsenal eventually studied the report. They concluded that the tungsten carbide cores in some production batches had been brittle, that at certain impact angles, especially against sloped armor, the cores shattered on contact instead of penetrating. That HVAP was a powerful weapon under the right conditions, and that no weapon, no matter how powerful, was a guarantee. Sergeant Baker's tank survived that engagement. The Panther survived as well. Both crews drove away in the November dusk. Both crews would fight again on some other day, against some other enemy, on some other patch of frozen ground. That was what the war looked like, in the autumn of 1944, for the men who fought it from the inside of an American medium tank. Then came December. The morning of December 16th, 1944, 5:30 a.m., the men of the 28th Infantry Division and the 106th Infantry Division had been told they were sitting on a quiet sector. The Ardennes was a rest area, a place where divisions rotated through to absorb replacements and recover from the bloodletting in the Hurtgen forest farther north. It was forested, hilly, supposedly impassable for armor. Intelligence had reported no significant German activity for weeks. At 5:30 a.m., along an 80-mile front, 1,600 German artillery pieces and rocket launchers opened fire. The night sky went white. Trees exploded. Farmhouses collapsed into their cellars. Men who had been asleep in their sleeping bags 20 seconds earlier were dead in their sleeping bags 20 seconds later, without ever quite waking up to understand what had happened to them. Behind that barrage came 250,000 German soldiers, 5 Panzer divisions, 3 SS Panzer divisions, Tigers, Panthers, Panzer IVs, and a small number of the newest, largest German tanks in the war, the Königstiger, the King Tiger, 68 tons of armor, with a long 88mm gun that could reach out and kill a Sherman at 2,000 yards. The Ardennes offensive had begun. The Americans called it the Battle of the Bulge, after the shape the German salient made on the battle maps, as it pushed westward into Belgium. By any name, it was the largest German offensive on the Western Front since 1940. Hitler had stripped his entire army of armored reserves for one final gamble: punch through the American lines, reach Antwerp, split the British and American armies, foresaw a negotiated peace. For the American Sherman crews standing in the path of that offensive, December 16th was the day the war became something it had never been before. It became a fight for survival. The HVAP shortage came hard, and it came fast. By the time the German armor reached the American positions, the average Sherman 76mm was carrying 5 HVAP rounds. 5 rounds against an enemy who was throwing hundreds of Panthers and dozens of Tigers and King Tigers at a single American sector. Tank battalions reported using their entire HVAP allocation in a single day of combat and finding no resupply available. Production back in the United States had increased. By November, American arsenals were turning out 5,000 rounds per month. By January, it would reach 7,000. But production at the arsenal did not mean ammunition in a tank's ready rack. The rounds had to be shipped across the Atlantic, then across the Channel, then forward, by truck convoy, through snow-blocked roads that were now being interdicted by German artillery and German patrols probing into the American rear. Some shipments never reached the front. Others reached the wrong units. Tank crews who survived the first days of the offensive, later described watching their gunners load the last HVAP round, fire it at a Panther, and then ask the loader for another, and hear the loader answer that there was nothing left. After that, they fired standard M62. And standard M62 against a King Tiger at any range was a way of telling the German crew exactly where you were hiding. The weather made it worse. For the first 8 days of the offensive, low cloud cover and heavy snow held the American Air Force on the ground. The P-47 Thunderbolts and the P-38 Lightnings that had broken German columns at Arracourt and across France could not fly. American tankers, who had grown used to calling in air support when they encountered Panthers, had to fight those Panthers alone, with 5 HVAP rounds, sometimes fewer, sometimes none, in the twin villages of Krinkelt and Rocherath on the northern shoulder of the German advance. Men of the 2nd Infantry Division and the 99th Infantry Division held off elements of the 12th SS Panzer Division through 3 days of close-range fighting that left burned-out tanks of both armies sitting in the same street. American bazooka teams crept along basement walls in ruined houses and waited for Panthers to roll past the windows. When the Panthers came, the bazooka teams fired at ranges of 20 feet. 20 feet. Close enough to hear the German crews shouting to each other over the engine noise. Close enough to see the whites of the driver's eyes through the vision slit. If you looked hard enough before you fired. At 20 feet, a bazooka round could kill a Panther through the side skirt armor. At 20 feet, the man firing the bazooka was standing inside a house that a Panther could level with a single high-explosive round. Some of the bazooka teams did not survive the shots they had taken. Sherman crews backed their tanks into barns and waited for German columns to pass in front of the open barn doors. When the last Panther in a column had gone by, the Sherman would fire at the engine deck of the rear tank from a range of 30 or 40 yards. The engine would catch fire. The Sherman would back deeper into the barn as the surviving Panthers tried to work out what had just happened behind them. Tank destroyer battalions equipped with M10s and M36s sat in concealed positions along forest tracks and waited for the King Tigers to walk into their kill zones. When a King Tiger came, they fired 1 round at the drive sprocket or one of the road wheels, and if they were lucky, the King Tiger threw a track and stopped moving, and then they fired their 2nd round at the side of the turret at close range, and if they were even luckier, the King Tiger died there in the snow. Some of those Americans were 19 years old. Some of them were farmers from Ohio, mechanics from Pennsylvania, college students from California, who had been in a chemistry class 6 months earlier. They were fighting through the longest, coldest nights of their lives. They were fighting with the limits of their ammunition to them down to the last round. They were fighting without air support, without artillery in many cases, without the luxury of picking their engagement ranges or their firing positions. They held. That was the thing that mattered. They held. And behind them, in his brick laboratory outside Boston, a metallurgist was studying a fresh report from an ordnance officer in Europe about a Panther, about 7 bounced rounds, about a sergeant named Baker. The war was still not over. The math had not yet been settled. And the men who were paying for that math was somewhere in Belgium in December, in the snow, with 5 rounds of tungsten in their racks, and the sound of a Panther engine coming up the road. There is one more piece of this story that needs to be told before we get to the end. It is not an American piece. It is a German one. The idea of the tungsten-core armor-piercing round did not come out of Boston. It did not come out of Watertown Arsenal in the spring of 1942. It did not come out of the fertile minds of American metallurgists working shift in a brick laboratory outside the city. It came out of Germany, years earlier. The Germans called it the Panzergranate 40. Armor-piercing composite rigid. A projectile built around a small, dense tungsten carbide core, surrounded by a lightweight steel body and a thin ballistic cap. The physics were identical to what would eventually become HVAP. The purpose was identical. Defeat armor that ordinary steel rounds could not defeat. The Panzergranate 40 entered service in 1940. 4 years before HVAP reached Cherbourg, the Germans developed versions of it for the 37mm anti-tank gun that had gone into Poland and France, for the long 50mm gun that had killed British tanks in the desert, for the 75mm guns on the Panzer IV, for the 88mm anti-aircraft gun that had become the most feared anti-tank weapon of the entire war. For every caliber that mattered, the Germans had a tungsten-core round. They had thought of it first. They had built it first. They had used it first. And by 1943, they had run out of the tungsten to keep making it. Germany had less tungsten than the United States did. No Bolivia, no long-term contracts in the Andes. Only what could be captured in the early conquests, and what could be bought through neutral Portugal from mines in the Iberian Peninsula. By 1943, the German High Command faced the same choice the Americans would face a year later: machine tools or ammunition, and the Germans chose machine tools first. Production of the Panzergranate 40 was cut sharply. The remaining tungsten went into cutting tools for the plants that were building aircraft engines and submarine components. By 1944, German Panther crews engaging American Shermans in the hedgerows and the open country of Lorraine were firing standard armor-piercing rounds. Solid steel, the old-fashioned kind. The kind that the German designers themselves had known since 1940 was not the best answer. The Germans had invented the concept. They had run out of the raw material to use it. The Americans had not invented the concept. They had simply, through a combination of geography and diplomacy and ruthless industrial efficiency, secured enough tungsten to produce 33,000 rounds of HVAP by March of 1945 and to ship them to the men in the tanks. That was the deeper story of the Tungsten War. The Germans understood the round perfectly. What they did not expect was that American industry, so far away, so slow to enter the fight, would produce it in quantities that mattered, while the German industrial machine, ground down by round-the-clock bombing and resource starvation, quietly stopped being able to. The phrase that the newspapers back home would eventually use, that the Germans never expected HVAP, was not quite true. The Germans knew exactly what HVAP was. What they did not expect was that they would run out of tungsten first. And in the Ardennes, in December of 1944, another thing they did not expect was that the weather would change. For the first 8 days of the offensive, the low cloud cover held. The American Air Force stayed on the ground. German columns moved forward through the snow in a way they had not been able to move since 1940. In the daylight, without the fear of a P-47 diving out of the sun. In columns that stretched for miles, headlights blacked out, tanks and half-tracks, and fuel trucks nose to tail, punching westward toward the Meuse River. Then, on the 23rd of December, the sky broke open. Christmas Eve dawned cold and clear. By mid-morning, the sky over the Ardennes was full of Allied aircraft. P-47 Thunderbolts of the IX Tactical Air Command, British Typhoons, American B-26 medium bombers, C-47 transports dropping supplies to the surrounded American paratroopers at Bastogne, fighter bombers in loose formations of 4, sweeping the roads, hunting. They found the German columns. They found them clustered on the road networks that the Ardennes terrain forced them to use. They found the fuel trucks that were keeping the Panthers and Highs moving. And they destroyed those columns, piece by piece, across the next 10 days. The German offensive, already overextended, already running low on the fuel that Hitler's planners had promised, would be captured from American depots, and never was, ground to a halt. By late January of 1945, the bulge in the line had been pushed back almost entirely to its starting position. The American army had lost approximately 80,000 men, killed, wounded, captured, or missing. The German army had lost approximately 100,000 men, and had spent the last fully equipped armoured reserves it would ever possess. The Battle of the Bulge was over. The men who fought it, on both sides, would talk about the cold for the rest of their lives, about the trees exploding overhead when artillery airburst rounds detonated in the pine canopy, about feet turned black inside boots that would not thaw, about sleeping under a Sherman that had thrown a track because the ground under a stopped tank, was 2 degrees warmer than the ground anywhere else. They would not, most of them, talk very much about HVAP. HVAP had helped, in the way that a good pair of gloves helps a man working in a blizzard. It had not decided the outcome. The outcome had been decided by American infantry holding crossroads, by tank destroyers in ambush along logging tracks, by Patton's Third Army racing north from Lorraine to relieve Bastogne, by the weather breaking on the 23rd of December and the Air Force coming back, and by the simple, unglamorous fact that the Germans had run out of gasoline before they had run out of road. That was the story of the last winter of the war. Fuel, not ammunition, not armor, not the caliber of a gun or the composition of a projectile. Fuel. In the spring of 1945, as American and British armies crossed the Rhine and Soviet armies stormed toward Berlin from the east, the German war economy collapsed in a way that no one inside Germany had predicted, and no one inside Germany could stop. Panther production, which had reached almost 4,000 units in 1944, fell off a cliff. The Mann plant in Nuremberg was bombed. The Daimler-Benz plant in Berlin was bombed. The MNH plant in Hanover was bombed. Components that had to travel between factories sat in rail yards that no longer had rails. Steel that had to come from the Ruhr now had to wait for a freight network that the American 8th Air Force and RF Bomber Command were taking apart, span by span, bridge by bridge, tunnel by tunnel. In January of 1945, the Soviet Vistula-Oder offensive rolled through central Poland and captured the industrial region of Upper Silesia. Silesia had supplied Germany with a substantial fraction of its coal, its steel, and its synthetic fuel. With Silesia gone, Germany had no path forward to producing the things a modern army needs to fight. And the things a modern army needs most are fuel and ammunition. In the final months of the war, hundreds of Panthers, hundreds of Tigers, hundreds of King Tigers were abandoned by their own cruiser along roadsides across western Germany. Not because American tanks had defeated them, not because HVAP had punched through their armor, because the fuel trucks never arrived, because the supply dumps had been bombed, because the Reichsbahn, the German state railway system, had ceased to function as a transportation network and become instead a long, twisted line of burning boxcars. A King Tiger weighs 68 tons. It burns roughly 3 gallons of gasoline per mile under combat conditions. A King Tiger with empty fuel tanks is a 68-ton steel monument to industrial defeat. Post-war examination of the German tanks that survived, or that were captured intact, told a story that the German High Command had been hiding from itself for months. Many of those tanks had full ammunition racks. Many of those tanks had functioning guns. Many of those tanks had crews who had been willing to fight. What they did not have was fuel. The HVAP round had nothing to do with any of that. The HVAP round had been a partial answer to a tactical problem in a specific class of engagement. The Sherman tank had been an imperfect weapon system, built in adequate quantities, supported by adequate logistics. The thing that had won the war in Western Europe was the same thing that had won every war American industry had ever fought from a position of full mobilization. It was the engine room, it was the steel mills, and the rubber plants, and the aluminum foundries. It was the assembly lines in Detroit and Warren and Youngstown. It was the convoys of Liberty ships running unmolested across an Atlantic that the US Navy had cleared of German submarines by the summer of 1943. It was the truck factories and the tire factories in Akron and the ammunition arsenals that had produced. By March of 1945, approximately 33,000 rounds of M93 high-velocity, armor-piercing ammunition for the 76mm gun. 33,000 rounds. That was a lot of tungsten, and it was still not enough. By the time the war in Europe ended on the 8th of May, 1945, the average American 76mm Sherman in the European theatre had received a total of perhaps 15 to 20 HE rounds across the entire campaign. Some had received fewer. A small number of priority units had received considerably more. None had ever received enough to stop worrying about how many they had left. The deciding number of the war in armored combat in the West was not the penetration performance of the M93 round against rolled homogeneous steel armor at 1,000 yards. The deciding number was roughly 50,000. That was the total number of M4 Sherman tanks of all variants that American factories produced during the war. The deciding number on the other side was approximately 6,000. That was the total number of Panzer V Panther tanks that German factories produced during the war, 8-to-1. That ratio was the war. That ratio was what Bradley had understood in the spring of 1944, imperfectly, when he had gambled on the 75mm Sherman being enough. That ratio was what Eisenhower had understood, imperfectly, when he had passed the ordnance department's written assurances down the chain of command. That ratio was also, in a colder and quieter way, the answer to the question Cooper had been asking every night in his notebook. The Sherman had not been the best tank of the war. It had been the tank that could be built, shipped, fueled, repaired, replaced. It had been a tank that 100,000 young Americans could learn to operate in a matter of weeks and take across an ocean. The Panther had been a superior fighting machine on the tactical battlefield. There had not been enough Panthers. There had never been going to be enough Panthers. That was the war. First, Lieutenant Belton Cooper finished the fighting as a captain. He had crossed Germany with the 3rd Armored Division all the way to the Mulde River, where the American and Soviet armies finally met on the front line of a broken continent. He had stopped counting dead Shermans somewhere in the Rhineland, because the counting had become the same column of numbers over and over again. By the end, the 3rd Armored Division alone had lost approximately 648 Shermans across the campaign. His division had been called the Spearhead Division. It had earned the name. It had paid for it. Decades later, Cooper would take the notebook out of the drawer where it had been sitting for most of his adult life. He would sit down at a desk in a quiet house in a quiet town, and he would begin to shape the entries into a book. He would call the book Death Traps. He would argue that the men who had directed American tank policy in the early 1940s had built the wrong tank, and that thousands of young Americans had died because of that decision. Historians would argue with him. They would argue that the Sherman, taken on its own terms as a balance between armor and firepower and reliability and producibility, had been a reasonable design for the war America was actually fighting. Some of those historians would be right. Cooper would also be right. Both things can be true at the same time in a war. General der Panzertrooper Hasso von Manteuffel, the small Prussian officer who had sent his panzer brigades to their deaths at Arracourt because Hitler had ordered it, was captured by American troops in the spring of 1945. He was held in Allied custody. He testified at Nuremberg as a witness on questions of German military operations. He was eventually released. He went into politics in the new West German democracy, served briefly in the Bundestag, and died in 1978 at the age of 81. He had lived long enough to see the country he had once fought for become an ally of the country that had defeated him. Sergeant Francis W. Baker, the veteran of North Africa and Sicily and Normandy, who had fired 7 HVAP rounds into the side of a Panther at Pfuffendorf and watched all 7 bounce, survived the war. He came home. He was discharged. He went back to civilian life in the way that men of his generation went back to civilian life, which was to say, quietly. He did not talk very much about what he had seen, not for decades, not to his wife, not to his children, not to anyone. That was the way of men from that time. Some of what they had seen, they carried with them until they died. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, the 29-year-old commander, who had bit down on his cigar at Salisbury Plain and written the orders for movement to France, went home too. But not the way most men did. He stayed in the army. He fought again in Korea. He commanded American forces in Vietnam from 1968 to 1972. During the hardest years of that long, difficult war, he became Chief of Staff of the United States Army in 1972. He died in 1974, at the age of 59, of complications from lung cancer. When the Army began designing the next generation of American main battle tank, in the early 1970s, they gave the program a name. They called it the M1 Abrams. The tank entered service in 1980. It and its successive variants would carry guns firing depleted uranium penetrators that defeated enemy armor through the same fundamental principle that had made the M93 work in 1944. A small, dense projectile driven at the highest velocity the gun could achieve would defeat armor that a larger, slower projectile could not. That principle had cost lives to learn. It had been learned across hedgerow country in Normandy, and in the open fields of Lorraine, and in the snow of the Ardennes, and in the burned streets of Aachen and Cologne. It had been learned by men who carried handwritten lists of HVAP allocations in their breast pockets, by men who watched their last round bounce off a Panther's flank and waited to see whether the German crew would notice them, or drive on, by men who burned to death inside a Sherman tank that history would later argue had not been so much worse than the alternatives. Some of those men came home, some of them did not. The ones who came home put the war into a box inside themselves, and they did not open it for a long time. Some of them never opened it. They went to work in factories, and on farms, and behind counters in small stores, in towns whose names you would recognize. They raised children, they paid mortgages. They watched grandchildren grow up. The ones who did not come home are still in cemeteries across France and Belgium and Luxembourg and the Netherlands, in rows of white crosses and stars of David that you can visit, if you choose, on any quiet afternoon in any month of any year. The HVAP round was a small piece of a very large story. It was a piece that mattered. It was not the piece that mattered most. The piece that mattered most was the American war economy, the men and women who served in it, the engineers who designed the machines, the workers who built them, the sailors who moved them across an ocean, the soldiers who carried them into combat with imperfect tools and imperfect ammunition and imperfect doctrine, and used them to bring the war to an end. That was what won. That is what is worth remembering. Not the wonder gun. Not the tungsten round. Not the story of a single perfect weapon that turned the tide. But the long, slow, unglamorous truth of an industrial democracy that had been slow to arm, slow to mobilize, and slow to understand what it was going to cost. But that had built, in the end, more Shermans than the Germans built Panthers, 8-1. And the young men who climbed into those Shermans on cold mornings in Belgium, with 5 rounds of tungsten in the rack, and the sound of a Panther engine coming up the road, and did what their country had asked them to do. They are the ones who won it. They are the ones worth remembering.